I'm glad you found they're recording this. That's good. Okay, so if you don't want to have that recorded, then don't speak. Anyway, welcome everyone. Gemar Chatima Tova. I'm getting signals here from my computer screen. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Sid, you are now unmuted. You were muted for a little bit. Okay.
Oh, okay. Good. So welcome everyone. Gemar Chatima Tova. I saw some of you last night, some of you during the day, some of you perhaps have just been accessing the services on Zoom, which is fine. This is again a very unusual year, and the community has done the best it could in a heroic way to kind of include as many people as possible. And I'm always pleased every year to have this conversation about my culinary sermon. Would have preferred to do it in person, but in fact, my plan was to do it from the Dachshund building, only to discover from Rena this morning that there were no computers in the building. So I had to kind of run home to kind of log on, but such as it is. I usually assume that most people have heard the sermon, but I've learned in past years that that's not always true. And I would ask people if they have cameras to put the cameras on. It's always great to see people's faces. I can't force you to do that, but it's much my preferred. It's the second best thing to being in person. So if people could put on their videos, we'll see who's here. And then that would be interesting to me, actually, if people who did not hear the sermon would raise their hand. I'm kind of curious how many people are in that category. Keep your hands up because I got to scroll through 3 screens. If you didn't hear the sermon, raise your hands. Okay, there are a handful in that category. So I'm going to do hopefully no more than a 2-minute summary for the benefit of those who were not there. It was called Eila Toldot. These are the generations, and I reflected on the challenges of having good communication between the generations. And I observed the difference between what might be called a more traditional model of in the Jewish world, where family legacies and family genealogies, everything was very close and intimate, and there was no question about that. Eila Toldot is the phrase from the Bible that says, that it translates as these are the generations. And I observed last night that when you have these are the generation, it sets the stage for a story, and the story clearly is being tied to a legacy that goes back many generations. And that's the way the Bible tells stories. And even our names in Hebrew are always, we identify our mother and our father. But in our own day, the contemporary world, that's less frequent. The whole notion of the autonomous self, young people finding their own destiny, finding their own way, is more typical. Many young people find that they need to put some distance, both geographical and emotional, to actually discover who they are or who they are meant to be. Sometimes and oftentimes parents feel wounded by that, feel hurt by that. They feel it's kind of an attack on who they were or what they represented or their household. I don't think that children always intend that, but sometimes they do. And how that bridge gets built back is always precarious. I use the metaphor of funerals about how oftentimes I've found that at funerals, children both observe 2 things. One is they realize how little they know about their parents, and suddenly for many, the journey of discovery begins to say, boy, I want to know more now about my now deceased mother, my now deceased father. And I observed that. And I told several stories in the sermon, but one story that I offered, I think most compellingly, was a memoir written by a friend of mine named Ethan Davidson, who was the son of William Davidson, a very prominent philanthropist out of Detroit, who one time owned the Detroit Pistons. And Ethan left home soon after high school to essentially find his way. And he used the word individuation, which is the psychological term for a young person who learns who they are separate from their mother or father or their home of origin. And individuation is considered by psychologists healthy, but sometimes it's not always interpreted that way by everyone in the family. And Ethan had to go very far from his father and his family to essentially find himself, only to come back home and ironically return to a lot of the things that are most cherished by his father. But the passage I read from the book was, I think, for most people quite chilling, because he continually pushed his father away, even when his dad began coming to concerts, because he made his living as a singer-songwriter. When his dad started coming to concerts when he was in the Detroit area, Ethan had to tell his father, please don't come. And he said, I'll paraphrase the quote from last night, I don't think my father ever understood how much I needed to be apart from him to discover who I am. So that was kind of the theme of the sermon. And I will have to say that in the parking lot conversations I had last night and this morning, I've heard amazing stories from families for whom parts of the message resonated. And I think I'd like to establish and create a platform for that kind of conversation here, because the stories are wide and varied and worth understanding. And I think it expands all of our understandings of this whole notion. So I would ask if people want to share something that touched them from the sermon, that resonated, a conversation that got sparked in your own family as a result of it, or that you would like to have in your family in the next days or weeks because of the sermon, to share that here. I'll ask you to do that by raising your hand electronically, which you do under either reactions, I understand, on my computer, or there was another way to do it if you know how to do that. And Nancy Solomon, who's moderating, is going to actually call on people. And I would ask you that when you share, that you be mindful that there are many people who want to share. So if you would restrain your sharing to about a minute and no more, we'd appreciate that, to create as much time for people to share as possible. The last thing I will say is, although this session was meant to go for an hour, I was told by Rena that no one is taking over the channel. And when we've done this in person in past years, we've gone past an hour. So I'm happy to stay on the call. The nice thing about being on Zoom is that you can leave the room and you don't have to feel embarrassed. You know, when you're in person, people see you get up and walk out and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe X did that. But here, you know, when you've had enough, feel free to go to another Zoom room or take a rest or take a walk. No harm, no foul. But we will go beyond an hour because I expect there's a lot to be shared. So if you'd like to share something that triggered in you as a result of the sermon, Nancy, I'll ask you to call people in the order in which they posted and raise their hands.
Thank you. And you're all now able to unmute yourself. So feel free to do that as you're called. So Robert Spurtis.
Oh, I didn't know we were first. Well, as part of our things to do when we retired, we tried to go back and start working on family genealogies. And our two sons expressed a profound disinterest in all this until recently, when one of our sons suddenly heard about something called Storyworth. And his friends were doing it. And the idea is that you pay $100 to this company, and this company then sends you questions to answer.
And he paid it.
And he paid for it, which was even better. And so suddenly we're being inundated with a question a week. Who was the most important influence on you, your mother or your father? What was the most surprising thing that happened to you during your life? We get all these questions. All of a sudden, we can't tell enough about ourselves to our kids, to at least one son, and the other group is kind of going along with it too. They went in together. So sometimes the technology, in our case, technology stepped in where it needed to at the right time.
Yeah, Bob, just say the name again of the company. I didn't catch it.
It's called Storyworth, one word.
Storyworth, WORTH.
Yes.
Yeah,
and it's basically you sign up, you give them $100.
Well, I don't know if it's $100.
Well, he paid for it. We think it's $100, and then they will take all of these stories as you send them in. They can include pictures and all these other things. And at the end of 1 year, they produce a book. And if you don't do it, if you do it the way they say, you've sort of lost control of all this. So what we do is we make a Word file and then copy that Word file so that we've got the information in case we want to add to it or do something after this project is over. But it was something that we never expected. Our kids have gone their own way, and we have cordial but not intimate knowledge of everything that they do on a daily basis. So it kind of brought us back together.
Beautiful. So let me just make two suggestions. One is if you would put in the chat box the name of the company, people might be interested in that. But the other thing, the lesson from Bob's sharing here is that so often what we most hope our kids might do cannot be suggested by you. It's got to come from a third source. I mean, we've seen that again and again and again. If their friends do it, if it becomes a thing, on social media, whatever else, they may come to it. Bob, you need to mute now.
Yeah, I will. We just want to write it in here. Okay.
But when you have all these ideas, you need to find a disinterested third party to suggest it to your kids. And that's, by the way, the phenomenon of funerals, which I talked about last night, that oftentimes when kids hear eulogies about their parents from other people, they say, oh my gosh, my mom did that. My dad did that. How could I not know that? And then that's suddenly the interest. And it's so, in my case, in my view, tragically ironic that a kid becomes interested in their parents' story only after they're gone and is triggered by something like a funeral. All right.
Next up is Harriet and Clem Sugarman.
Thank you. And Sid, thank you for your wonderful words last night. What happened to us kind of happened a little organically. We were updating our will a few years ago, and we wanted to include a number of things that would have a direct impact on our kids. And we, in fact, started the whole process with writing out our own ethical will. And then we shared the documents with our children and got important feedback from them, particularly as it related to some of the things about what we wanted to leave our grandchildren. And the discussion was so meaningful. And I'm not sure, I think that it might have happened at another time, but it was interesting to us that it was in creating our will that generated the conversation. The other comment I would like to make is about generational differences. When we were growing up, we didn't really fully see our parents as people. And we did hear family stories, but as my generation became parents, the circle of our friends, I heard more and more about how important it was to us for our children to know us more fully. Now, whether our children think they know us more fully or not, you'd have to ask them. But it's interesting to me, and I think we've had opportunities sometimes because of controversy that has led to conversations where more about sharing ourselves and our values and our thoughts has come out. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Harriet.
So next up is Elisa Kaplan.
Oh, it's Lise. Thanks so much. And thank you, Rabbi Sid. That was really, really wonderful, everything you said last night. So I had a very specific memory that it spurred on. And when you talked about sort of the recognition of your parents at the time of their funerals, it made me remember my dad passed away about 2.5 years ago, just shy of his 91st birthday. Sorry about the Lillystone traffic. And we were actually very fortunate. He had been an elementary school principal in Brooklyn, in a school with a lot of underprivileged kids. And he told us a lot about his work, some funny stories, a lot of sad stories. So we did know a lot about his work. And when he was in the nursing home, even, he would share still a lot of memories. But what happened right before his funeral was my brother had found an email. We knew a lot of the teachers and people he worked with. We had met them when we were younger, found an email from one of the teachers and sent out the news of my father's passing, who passed it on to a whole sort of email chain of other former teachers. And he started to get these email responses talking about how my dad had been such an inspiration for them as a teacher. And he'd learned so much, had been so inspired by his work. And I realized I knew a lot about my dad did. And what my so back up for a second. My brother at the funeral conveyed this and said the lesson from this is to tell people while they're alive how much you appreciate them. He wished my dad had seen this like voluminous email response about how amazing it was. And I realized we hadn't really sat down, even though we had had conversations, and said, wow, Dad, what you did was amazing. You know, that you've gone into school, you know, getting up at 5 a.m. and working with these kids and these families for years and years, that he hadn't really heard that, you know, from us or from other people. And so the funeral is this opportunity, this sort of sad, what you said last night, this sad opportunity to realize how little he had heard all these wonderful things. So it stops there.
Thanks for sharing that, Elise. Yeah.
Ira,
Yeah, hi.
please share.
Ira Abrams here. A couple of quick points. One, a number of years ago, Kay and I went to a workshop on writing your memoirs, which was done by a famous writer. And one of the first things she said is, you don't write your memoir for your kids. They don't really care. You write it for your grandkids. They'll want to hear it. And we both stuck to that. It's really interesting. And Kay being Kay, she started hers already, I think. Second thing, the issue of needing to leave family to become yourself. I know from my experience that I think a lot of families and people have difficulty accepting differences. And if you need to be different, I personally felt the need to be distant, not forever, but for a long time, quite a long time. And kind of making an example to show the truth of that. My father is very, very sick now. He had heart surgery a few years ago. He got COVID, even though he's been vaccinated twice. A month ago, he's in the hospital, and talking with his now wife, my mother died about 20 years ago, and doctors, we decided to unplug him a day and a half ago. And being my father, he's up and around now. He's leaving the hospital. And that's who my father is as a person. And it kind of sums him up. So for me to become my own person, I had to get out of the state and get far away for a long time. And I've been back, but at least that's my experience. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ira. Let me just interject here, because lest I be misunderstood. I am not of the view, I mean, I'm sure many a rabbi could give a version of the sermon that would hold aloft, the good old traditional family system and how horrible it is when kids move away and lose connection. I'm not of that view. My own individuation was not dramatic or rebellious in any way, but it's clear in my mind that I started to realize my destiny only after moving out of my house and moving a couple hundred miles away to establish my own identity. And I wouldn't be that person. So I don't yearn for the days when kids grew up and bought a house next to their mom and dad, which still happens to some ethnic communities, by the way. I don't think we're better off for that. I think we are better off with kids being able to spread their wings and find out who they are. But I do think we've lost something in the process. And so I was trying to find some happy middle ground between validating individuation. And by the way, the end of my sermon, I may say more at the end of this session about how I did a 180 on my own sermon about a month ago, which you might find of interest. So I'm not of the view that individuation is bad, even though I took Ethan Davidson's memoir as the most extreme example of pushing away a very prominent father.
Next, Lisa Fuentes and her partner wanted to ask a question, though they weren't able to raise their hand, and I don't see where they are on the screens. But if you want to unmute.
Here we are.
Okay.
Hi, Lisa. Hi.
Hi. Well, first of all, I thought it was a really wonderful and inspiring sermon. And I'm a convert. So the interesting first thing that happened was that I feel this long connection of multiple Jews through generations. And the connection is through the Bible, through the readings, through repeating over and over these incredibly complex ideas and these very complex prayers that change in rhythm, in music through the year. in fact, part of your speech was about the complexity of the human spirit, of the human being. I also was very moved by the absence of the importance of the last names. That was, again, one of the things that I got from the sermon. You were talking about Ben, Shlomo, Ben, the son of so-and-so, who's the son of somebody, etc., etc. In contrast to the other world that I come from, in which family you come from is what is emphasized. And your last name is emphasized, your family name is emphasized, not because of your deeds necessarily, because of your importance, your standing. My husband over here is, censoring the fact that I think that very much in contrast to the Catholic world that I grew up, which was a oppressive, asphyxiating, controlling type of mindless repetition, and also the fear of God, which also very much exists in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Catholic world is a bleeding Christ that is dying for my sins. So I am not in agency of my life. And, needless to say, my own individuation has taken me very far away from my own ancestors. But the richness is all the conversations, even in the car coming home, around that ancestry and the meaning to our families.
So interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Myrna Seidman. Do you want to unmute?
So, Sid, as I said to you last evening, your sermon really touched me in many different ways. About eight or 10 years ago, I wrote a family history. My parents are immigrants, and I wanted to tell their story of coming to America, and as much as I could describe what their life was like. Then in the last couple of years, I started writing sort of family personal memoirs, picking incidents and experiences in my life that I wrote about. They were relatively short, and I mentioned it, and I shared them, many of them, with both sons. And it's interesting that one son has basically not responded, and I have not asked him. And the other son, who is sitting here, and he might want to comment, has not only responded, but has been a very enthusiastic fan and has really encouraged me to continue to write and continue to share the stories. So do you want to say something, Jesse, about the reaction? I'm putting him on the spot. This is my younger son, Jesse.
Hi, everybody. I think that what's interesting is when multi-generations can do this with Myrna's stories. I certainly have a recollection of her telling these stories a long time ago, some of them. But I'll ask a certain question meant to elicit more thought or more of an emotional response. So for us, it's almost iterative. Myrna's doing 98% of the work. I'm doing 2% of the listening. And in that, she then will sometimes revise or deepen the story in a very effective way. So for us, we're deriving great enjoyment from it.
I wanted to say that basically I started it because I wanted my grandchildren to know who I was. And I wasn't sure that my children would tell it. So I decided to speak in my own voice. And it's been enormously satisfying to me. It's really opened up, it's given me a lot of opportunity for reflection. And it's been a very it's been a very meaningful experience. So I recommend it to others.
Great. Thanks, Myrna. Thanks for sharing Jesse with us. Good to meet you, Jesse.
Likewise.
By the way, If you've joined late, I would urge you, if you would put in your cameras, if you don't mind, so we have more of a sense of intimacy of being together here in this Zoom room. I see a lot of people joined since we started, but I just want to put that request out once again. Okay.
Hi, so next we have Arthur Berger.
Thank you. And Sid, thank you also for last night's conversation, because it reminded me of a number of things in my own family. First of all, some of you probably know that I was in the US Foreign Service and I retired from there 26 years ago. But I was still in college, my last year in college, and I convinced my parents to come with me down to Florida. I used to drive people's cars down every winter during intercession. And my father had a cousin that owned a motel on what is now South Beach and then used to be an old age home. We had a free place to stay. On the way down in the middle of the night, my parents again brought up something that they wanted me to do with my life. I was a student at Yeshiva University. I was in the rabbinic program, and they wanted me to be an Orthodox rabbi. And I told them, you know, that's not really for me. What I really want to do is I want to join the Foreign Service. And my father, who was an immigrant from Europe, said to me, thought it was the Foreign Legion. And he said, what do you mean you're going to go fight someplace in an awful place? Stay here in America. It's a wonderful country. And I said, no, I want to represent America. I want to be an American diplomat. Nobody in our family's ever done anything like that. And he said, well, you're going to go to Europe? It's a terrible place. They hate us. Why should you go there? I said, no, I want to go to Africa. I did go to Africa. And I think that my father never understood. We never really had that kind of a conversation to talk about what it is that we really wanted from life. So years later, after I retired from the Foreign Service, and in fact, I was working at the Holocaust Museum at that time, I was invited by the State Department to give an oral history of my life. And I said, gee, there's a great opportunity. And I did that. And I've got a draft of it right here. It's 135 pages or so. And someday I'll have time to go through and edit it. But I decided I wanted to do that because I wanted my kids and our grandchildren to know, where did we come from? You know, what was life like? What are the decisions that we made? What are the experiences that we had? A different thing, if I can introduce a sister of mine who lives in Jerusalem, she married a Holocaust survivor from Poland, and he passed away a few years ago. But in the last years of his life, he wanted to do a history of his life. He had been speaking at schools and talking to his kids for many, many years about his feeling, and did a Survivors of the Shoah Foundation video as well. But then they did that, and after he died, my sister was able to publish his memoir for his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and for us as well. And it's a way that you really connect with your family and with your children in a way that I guess the other generation before never really even thought about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur.
Should have shown the book.
Linda or Claude, I'm not sure who has their hand up, one or the other.
It's me, Claude, but Linda's by my side. We didn't hear your sermon, though we're looking forward to reading it in print. I have found that there's a lot of my mother's story that I don't know. And a lot of my story when I was young, which I don't know. By that I mean before the age of 8 or 6. We bopped around from Paris to Vienna to London, and there were all sorts of important things I wanted to know, including about my mom. And I realized that there were two possibilities, that she'd never told me her story, or that she told me her story, but I hadn't been interested, I hadn't listened, I hadn't remembered. And I didn't know which possibility it was. So now, okay, so I never know some things, some of which are quite important to me. Why did we move from Vienna to London in 1936? There could be many answers, and I don't know what it was or what makes. That's an important example. It was like, okay. So now when I meet a young adult or an older child, I say, I've got one piece of advice for you. By the way, I give advice all over the place. Some people, you know. Listen to your parents when they're telling their story. Listen and try to remember. That's one piece. And another piece of it is ask questions of your parents. Ask them now because the parents will die one day. I don't generally say that line, but it's a line. Ask and remember what you are told. And then I move on to, and when you're 25, you should do this, and when you're 40. That's it.
Thank you, Claude. Steve Brody, I think you're up. Nancy, you're muted, Nancy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve Brody. I'm sorry.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sid, for your sermon, and it got me thinking about how much I felt there was very open and transparent visibility with our kids, our two millennial kids in California. Mainly, we seem to, fortunately, want to communicate with each other and do it. And the technology, of course, is incredible compared to what we had growing up. So, whether I'm on my bicycle and I see a beautiful scene and I share it by text to the family, or if I'm out like I was 2 days ago at NRA headquarters for the monthly vigil for more sane gun laws, they get to see that these sort of instantaneous little snippets of what their parents are doing, and Sandy gets to do similar things. But reflecting upon that during your sermon makes me realize that, yeah, that's great, but that's not these detailed kinds of give and take kind of conversations that let's touch on, what motivates you to do this, or why, where do you see it going, and that sort of thing. And that's something that your sermon has made me reflect on. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Steve.
Jane Feldman.
Hi. First of all, Sid, like everybody else, I just found your sermon so moving, and I'm not even sure what all the pieces are that touch me so much, but it was very, very moving to me. And then listening to the conversation about the eulogies and, learning more about parents afterwards, it reminded me of an aspect of my experience of losing my parents also about almost 3 years ago, and very close together. And I was writing eulogies and then sharing it with friends. And the impact on the conversations that I had with my friends, including friends of decades, was really striking to me. For some of my dearest friends of decades, they were saying, I didn't know that about your mother, or, oh gosh, I didn't think about your father that way. And I didn't know that. And I felt really sad, and all the time that we had talked about our relationships or our relationships to our parents, it wouldn't have occurred to me to sort of say, well, let me tell you, about the things that my mother went through that shaped who she is, that influenced who I am. And so that was really striking. And then in just sharing with people at a dot, when I came back after, my parents had died, and people saying, oh, now that I read the eulogy, this is why you're such and such. Now I see where you get that. And or people then starting to talk about their own parents and their parents' deaths. And it just, there was just that whole dimension of what it sort of did for me in my circle of friends. And this conversation just took me back to that experience that I haven't thought about for a couple of years.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jane. You know, it's so interesting. What occurs to me as you're speaking is that many of us are a sandwich generation. So many of us are an age where we have aging parents who are dying or have died in the recent past. So we're thinking about how well do we hear their stories and how much should we learn before while we have the time or not. But then we also all have, many of us have grown children who are making their own way. And so the sermon quite intentionally was trying to like trigger both sides of the sandwich, right? Like one, a reflection about how do we relate to our parents and how much of their stories do we know? But number two is how might we repair that with our kids so that they are not in our place 30, 40 years from now, right? I mean, how do we do that in a constructive way? And I don't have any simple answers, but I made a few suggestions last night. But that's, you know, I just wanted to put that out there.
Next is Linda or Irv Weinberg.
Yeah, hi, so this is Irving. So I remember when I was in school, I met this Japanese postdoc and he said, well, I'm not the firstborn, so I had to leave the house. That's just kind of their tradition there is that you have to go away. So he went from Japan to the US. For me, I remember my dad once telling my mom that, well, here's a picture of your son. That's about as much as you should expect to see of him. And it was kind of like that. I left the house when I was 21 and I never—
But you were the firstborn.
I was the firstborn, but I really never went back until we got married. And then we saw our folks quite a lot more. And my son also, as soon as he could, he moved out as far as he could. And so, you know, this is our trait. It's not necessarily a good thing. But that's kind of it, but I guess it's familial.
Yeah, thanks, Irving. I guess I'm tempted, you can say no, but you've shared that quite dispassionately. And I'm wondering if there's anything more you want to say about, as you reflect on that, do you wish it were different, or you think you kind of said that's the way our family is?
Well, my dad was, I won't call him Holocaust survivor. He was really a Holocaust hero, but he was Hungarian trained, had been in the Hungarian army, quite strong-willed, and probably I was like that too. So I don't know whether it was because of that. Certainly, I don't think I prefer this. Our daughter is much closer to us, but I think it's I just think it's either in the genes or the upbringing. I don't know. I don't know.
Thanks, Irving.
Suzanne Richmond.
Suzanne, do you have any video?
Yes.
Or not?
Oh, what?
Can you put your video on while you're speaking?
I'm actually lying in my bed with sore throat and not feeling great. So
Okay.
I could put it on.
Your choice.
Is it important?
Well, it's whatever. It's your choice. We'd love to see you, but if you prefer not, your choice.
I'll tell you what, I'll take a look in the mirror, and if I feel like it, I'll join you, okay?
Why don't you share? Go ahead.
Did we lose her? Should we go to?
I have nothing. I just okay. I don't have where's the video? Start video. Hold on. Unable to access camera. You know, it's really not important that I speak. I mean, I will once I do the technology thing, but maybe, I mean, I didn't put my hand up.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay,
Your
your
hand was,
hand
oh,
was up. Okay.
Oh, I thought you were, just calling on me out of,
no. So feel better. And if you have something to say later on, we'd love to hear from you. Okay.
thank you. I'll show my face. It's okay.
Why don't we go on? At least I see a hand up for Bob and Amy Aronoff. So if that's true, go ahead and speak.
Yes, it's true, although I'm the only one here on video. I wanted to say to you, Sid, first of all, how meaningful and important your talk was. It really touched us and made us think. What I wanted to talk about was about a year ago. Well, first of all, let me just say we have two children. Our older son is the one who has moved away and was very careful to establish boundaries with us. We don't call him. If we want to hear from him, we have to wait for him to call us. But he is the one who's really interested in the family history. And about a year ago, he said he wanted to interview Bob. So when he came for a visit, he set up his video camera and they did about a 5-hour interview of Bob, which we have recorded, in which he talked about his entire life, starting from childhood on. And what I found so interesting myself was we've been married for 47 years, and there were things I didn't know. And many things I knew but hadn't heard in many years. It was so valuable even for me, but especially for the kids. So it was just interesting that he was the one that reached out and wanted to do this, because he is the one who's sort of kept his distance from us. And, that was pretty much it. I'm waiting for my turn to have an interview, but it hasn't come up yet. So that was really all I wanted to say.
So interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Amy. Thank you.
Gail, it's your turn. No? Oh, right.
There. Okay, I got it. First of all, I'm going to be part of the chorus. Sid, you were terrific last evening, but it also made me think back to a talk you'd given a few years back about the 20 questions. And so I even hearkened back to that talk and remembered it. And so excited, your grandfather. Welcome to the club. There's nothing like it. So welcome. I wanted to say that what I was thinking about as we were talking about generation is, how did I get my generational information? A few weeks ago, I finally listened to my husband and started cleaning out part of the basement. I'm not really good about that. And came across a tape that I always used to have a tape recorder with me when my family gathered. I'm an immigrant. I came from Germany after the war. And we all lived within minutes of each other. My mom and one of her sisters never lived more than literally across the window from the next person. And we would get together a lot on Shabbatot and, holidays. And when I came to visit, which was always from very far away, the family would gather and I would have my tape recorder. And that's the way we got generational information. I never sat down with any of my cousins or uncles and questioned them. We just heard, and the tape that I had was my favorite uncle was talking about back home and what had happened and what Grabowitz, Poland was like pre-war and the family growing up. That is the way I understood the way families met and talked about things. And so I could tell you lots of stuff about any one of my family members as a kid because I learned it. But that's not what happens now. When I gather with my friends, as somebody very eloquently talked about, we don't talk about, well, tell me what traits you have from your father, or tell me what your mother said about. We don't usually get to those conversations. And so it really does happen at the transitional points of our lives, I think, when you stop and you pay attention and you focus in on things you might not have at other times. So you know, I use various techniques to let my grandkids and kids know about what our lives are about, but they're going to be interested in maybe some of the things I've put together, like I put together some books about my mom for them, because my father has almost no background history for any of us to find, and that he never spoke about. But at any rate, that's the way that generation is going to at least learn about my mom, and will be interesting to see what they learn about my husband and myself as we get together and talk. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Gail.
Susan Kimmel.
Thank you so much. And I first want to say mazel tov to Sid and Sandy and the birth of their grandson. That's great news.
Thank you.
And sort of relate, and I love the talk last night, but it focused on the intergenerational between parents and child. And for me, it was also a matter of introducing my kids to their grandparents, whom they really never got to know. My father passed away before either was born. My mother passed away when my older son was 8 weeks old. On the other side of the family, my former mother-in-law passed away the week before my father did, and my father-in-law passed away before Adam was born. So in other words, they never knew their grandparents. To me, it was important to get to know something about that. And one way I tried to achieve that, rather than writing family biographies, which takes a lot of time, was I planned a roots trip. And I thought that this is one way to go back even further in generations to my grandparents and great-grandparents, I guess. I don't know. Yes, some of them were even older than that, by going to Eastern Europe. And thought that by sitting together in the car for hours and hours, we could tell some family stories. And that did happen quite a bit of the time, and it was very meaningful to me. There are more stories I would like to tell. Maybe that's exactly what you're saying, is that this is an ongoing process. But I think it had to sort of bring things to life, to show that these roots are important. And I loved how you concluded last night, Sid, by saying that knowing more of your family, how deep these roots are, and what traditions preceded you, really helps build resilience in your kids. They can withstand so much more because they know from, who they are in the long term. And this was made really clear to me during one Pesach, when my daughter-in-law, who's African-American, said she loved the fact that Jews can trace their history. Many know who their families are and go back, but she really is not able to go back more than 2 generations, and finds that really, I think in terms of resilience, I think that really does make a significant difference. So thank you for pointing that out. And now we'll have to work on finding ways to connect with the kids between the immediate generation and maybe write our stories. Just as an aside, and I'm sorry this is so disjointed, but as Gail was just saying with the tape recorder, when 2 of my uncles, one turned 80 and then the other turned 90 in the same year, and I gave them each portable tape recorders and asked them to write family stories, to record family stories. And the older one said, no way, he wasn't at all interested. He said, that was then, this is now. He wasn't going to start doing that. But the 80-year-old said, what's this, a tape recorder? I'm not dealing with that. But got out pencil and paper and wrote. It was illegible, but one cousin typed it up, and it turned out to be 50 pages of written material that I am so thankful for, because it really is very meaningful to me and shows a lot about what the family, this was my mother's family who came from Belarus, and really gave a lot of details. And so whatever techniques you can find, whatever works for you, please try it. And I'm so glad to hear other people sharing what they've done. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to just jump in here for a minute before we go. The sharings have been so rich, and we have many more coming up. But I promised to share pull back the curtain a little bit. And before we hit the hour and some people may be leaving, I just want to share a evolution that I made in the course of developing the sermon. This kind of in the spirit of doing a theater talk back with the actors or the playwright, and I think there may be something instructive about that. So the early versions of the sermon were quite different. than what you heard last night. And the two things that triggered the sermon were, one, my reading Ethan's memoir of his life and his relationship with his father, and being at 3 funerals in a row, 1 memorial service and 2 funerals, where I had the feedback which I shared in the sermon about kids not knowing their parents. And I kind of reflected on that, and the early drafts of the sermon were quite one-sided, if I should say. It seemed great when I wrote it, but as I reflected more on it, it was all about why don't those ungrateful kids ask parents more about themselves after all we've done for them, and that's kind of, it wasn't quite that harsh, but it was that, when I got woke around it, it started to sound that way. And here's a great example. I've oftentimes talked about the power of Jewish texts. And one of my pet peeves about the way a lot of people use Jewish texts is that they look to find a source that validates a view that they already hold, which to me is not really allowing Torah to shape who you are and who you might become. I think the most exciting parts in my own Jewish journey is when I read a text that totally challenges what I think or what I do, and makes me step back and say, whoa, maybe I got this wrong, or maybe I have this wrong. And so, quite apart from the sermon development, which for me takes several months from the time I get an idea, I was in the process of convening a small group to look at a curriculum that I had some responsibility for back in the days that I was running Panim, an organization that I built around social justice and Jewish values. And there's now some interest in putting that back out into the marketplace. So I went back to a curriculum which I hadn't looked at for more than a decade. And I found the text, which I shared at the end of the sermon yesterday. And I remembered it, but it wasn't in the front of my consciousness. It was the text about that from Midrash Tanhuma, that we get 3 names in our lives. One that our parents give us, one that's given to us by the world based on what we do and how we're showing up, and one, the name that we give ourselves. And interestingly enough, last night in the parking lot, somebody stopped me in a conversation which was quite rich, and said, was that Midrash literal or metaphorical? I said, I'm quite sure it's metaphorical. And then she goes on to say that their daughter has decided to change her name. It's not yet quite a matter of gender transition, but it might go in that direction. But their daughter was reassessing who she was. She no longer identified with the name that her parents gave her. So unbeknownst to me, by sharing that text, it hit home very powerfully to this mom and dad who are dealing with, to what extent do they accept their daughter's desire to change the name that she was given at birth? And when I read the text, I realized how one-sided my sermon was. And that's when I did a whole redraft. And so what I decided to end with last night was less about, oh, woe are we parents for not being appreciated by our kids, or woe are we for not asking our parents more about them, but more about how parents need to understand, respect, and honor the path that their children choose. And these days, that's become even more dramatic than back in the 60s when we thought we were doing a lot of rebellion by growing our hair long and listening to rock and roll, right? That seems tame now compared to what's going on with parents who are dealing with everything from, gender transition to interfaith marriage to, total rejection of family roots and everything. And what do you do with that? How do parents deal with that? And so I'd like to think that the sermon has become rebalanced in a healthy way. God knows I may read it in 5 years and say, there was a huge blind spot that I missed even now. But I thought it'd be interesting to kind of share that from how do you inhabit multiple people's shoes when you're trying to address an issue that has so many touch points in terms of people's emotional lives and families. So I just thought that might be of interest to people to share that. So let's go back to the queue. I think Bob and Ann, you're next.
Well, Sid, your comments there were a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, which was sort of a multi generational tradition. And in our family, we sort of have a reverse kashrut history. My father and my grandfather, my mother's father, were committed Reform Jews. And when we would get together for meals, my grandfather took great pleasure in teaching me how to eat crabs and lobster. And it was not that they were not kosher. It was that eating crabs and lobster was their kashrut, because in their belief system, they felt that you really shouldn't waste your time figuring out how to be kosher. What you should do is spend time making sure that poor, hungry people had things to eat. And so by eating non-kosher food, they're reminding themselves to take care of poor people. Later, when I became, a parent, our children ended up going to our local congregation, which we loved. It was a conservative congregation. And on vacation one time when my son was 8 years old, I'm having clam chowder. He decides to try it. And I'm talking to a friend, and he comes around and grabs my shoulder, my sleeve, and says, "Dad, I had a thought." And I said, "What was your thought, Adam?" He said, "My thought was, there goes another non-kosher Jew." And then he pulled my sleeve again. He said, "And I had another thought." And then he said, "The other thought was just like his dad." And nowadays I rarely eat non-kosher food, but it's not that I have a sort of a confusion about it. I actually, if I'm keeping, kosher, I'm kind of honoring my son, and if I am not keeping kosher, I'm honoring my father and my grandfather. So I have many ways to connect to my family when it comes to food.
Bob, you missed a precious moment when Ann did this behind you. Thanks for sharing that.
Next up is Isabel and Ted Berman.
Okay, thanks. So this is Ted, and I guess based on Sid's sermon and what some other people have said this afternoon, I think I agree, maybe some personal experience with the comment made by a couple people that kids, these adult children, are more likely to listen to stories about their grandparents versus their parents. So I think in our case, like on my side of the family, our kids will listen to, let's say, a little more about stories that we hear from my father. So I think going to be a little more motivated to try to encourage, like my father and my mother, while they still can do it. We have the opportunity to have them tell more of their story about themselves and their families to our kids. I think they might be receptive to that, but don't have too long to do that. Now, Isabel's side, something similar. Unfortunately, her parents both died some time ago, so they didn't really have, our kids didn't really have time to get to know them, unfortunately, but she actually has a sister, back in Lima in Peru, who's a lot older than Isabel is, who I think can also be a valuable resource to tell some of the family stories about their grandparents and other relatives. So I think based on all this, be a little more motivated, maybe Isabel will too, to try to make that happen, while we still can.
Thanks, Ted.
Paula Eiblum.
Hi, I just wanted to add one thing. When I lived in Israel, my kids in the 7th grade had to part of the curriculum was interviewing your parents and your grandparents. And they had a list of questions: where were you born, and what, all kinds of things about their personal life, but mostly about where they lived and how they grew up. And I remember we didn't have any grandparents in Israel. So my son interviewed an uncle who told him a story about owning half a cow and sharing the other half with a different person in his shtetl of Biała Podlaska in Poland, and my son always wondered who got the milk. But that was because he was 12 when he asked that question. So that's all I wanted to add, that maybe it should be part of our curriculum. And the other thing is my grandniece, my sister's daughter, has been researching through Ancestry, 23andMe, and through other websites and online research. She has a family tree now that she's established for us of over 5,000 people, but not one do we know anything about, as you were talking about last night, Sid. I mean, they're just names, they're dates, but they don't mean anything other than the fact that now that we know that we go back a few generations. Other than that, we wouldn't know anything about our family. But it doesn't add any meat to the bones.
Right.
That's it.
Thanks, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sid, there's a question in the chat wanting to know the name of the author of the book addressing ethical wills that you mentioned in your talk. Is that something you can?
Yeah.
That was for me.
You know what? Somebody who's better at multitasking than I can just Google it right now and put it in the chat box. It's not coming to me, and I just want to stay present to the conversation.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay? There are 2 or 3 books, but one very well known one. So if somebody wants to just Google that and put it in the chat box, that'd be great.
The next person up is Judy Mark.
Hi, everybody. Many of you may not know me. I'm one of the original older members, moved to California many years ago. I love you, Sid, miss you, and really happy to be the only good thing about Zoom is that I get to be with this community again for the holidays. You know, this issue is so near and dear to my heart because I have a mother who passed away a number of years ago, but who was a voracious writer, and she loved to write her stories and stories about her life. And I, you know, because as young people do, never really cared about any of her stories until she died. And she had just reams and reams of, she took classes in like senior centers, and she just absolutely loved, you know, telling very short stories about a show that she saw. She grew up in New York, and a show that she saw on Broadway, or visiting in the opera, or you know, walking down the street in the 1920s when she was a little girl in Harlem. And so after she passed away, within the first couple of days, I collected all of her papers because I had, she had Alzheimer's. And so all those memories were gone at the end of her life. So even had I had the wherewithal to think about, tell me about your life in her waning days, she wouldn't have been able to tell me a lot of those stories, or at least not very accurately. We actually were able, because my mother had Alzheimer's, we were able to be part of the NPR. You know, NPR has this StoryCorps, and they had a very special StoryCorps section for people with Alzheimer's. And they would go into a recording booth, and I was able to do that with my mother before she lost all of her memory, and ask her questions that were recorded, and they gave me the CDs, and they're very precious to me. And so when I ended up reading all her stories to write her eulogy that I delivered at her funeral, I learned so much about her. It's like everything that you're saying, said exactly the same thing. I learned so much about her, and learned that she actually, you know, where she grew up, where she went to high school, which is basically 4 blocks away from where my daughter now lives and goes to college in New York City. And it just brought so much more. And so I agree that and now, interestingly, my daughter is very interested in her grandparents. And so we kind of skipped a generation, I think. And people always say my daughter is like a mini me, but she's actually a mini my mom. And so she's kind of living out the way my mom lived her life. So thank you for sharing all this stuff.
Judy, great. Thanks for sharing. And it's great to see you on Rosh Hashanah. Judy and her family made her way east because they were taking their daughter to college in New York. So we got to see her on Rosh Hashanah. It's great to see you always. You know, Judy's comment reminds me of something that I want to just interject again. One of the movies of my favorite movies of all time is an oldie but a goodie. I hope it's still available on video. And it's an adaptation of a short story written by a Canadian Jewish writer. And the movie is called Lies My Father Told Me. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie, but you must see this film. It is a charming film about an old grandfather from Europe who moves to Canada with his young family. And the grandfather is still driving his horse-drawn wagon, selling dry goods from shtetl to shtetl, and now in Canada from village to village. His son becomes a entrepreneur, successful, rejects his father's ways and his orthodoxy. Apropos of Bob's story, eats trafe just to spite his father and to say, I'm not going to do that. Or maybe the image is Abraham smashing his dad's idols, right? But the son, the grandson of the European grandfather adores his grandfather. And there's a lot of conflict with the father, but he goes in the grandfather's wagon, just to kind of soak in as much as he can from his grandfather's life. It is just a charming, charming story, which if you can find the film, you just got to see it. Elise Kaplan says, saw that movie when I was a kid and my parents had never forgot it. Yeah.
Susan and Hans.
Hi, nice to see everyone, and thank you for all your thoughts in your sermon yesterday. Rabbi said, I just wanted to share that we are fortunate enough to have an ethical will written by my great-great-grandfather who emigrated from near Odessa, Russia to Palestine, and also wrote 7 Torahs for our family, one of which was a Adat Shalom for our son's bar mitzvah. But what was wonderful about having his ethical will was the historical context of his life. And so not only in the sharing of stories about what you want to know about your parents and their lives, but also the opportunity to really demarcate your presence at a particular historical time as another, kind of impetus for writing our own stories, even if our children don't do it for us or attempt to get us to sit down for an interview. So it's been a very valuable thing. And then the only other comment was just in terms of funerals. I've often felt when we are at Shivas, wow, what a shame that I didn't know both more about this person who passed away, but also about the family of, like say it's someone's father and then the son is talking about their father, but also the context of their growing up. And wouldn't it be good to know more about our friends growing up? We meet each other oftentimes as adults, and there's so much context that we miss. And I'm always sorry to miss that context. So here's to more information, more sharing, and more writing.
Beautiful. Susan, I'm just going to make a request. I don't want to put you on the spot. You don't have to do it. But I would be fascinated in reading your great-great-grandfather's ethical will. If you want to share that, yeah. I don't think I've ever seen one that goes back 4 generations, if I've heard you correctly. Yeah. And I would be totally interested in the historical context, which I know a little bit about. If you want to share it with me, and I might suggest that it might have greater interest within the Adat Shalom community. So you may want to put that on the listserv, and if you're willing to share it, say, I was in the conversation, the sermon debrief on Yom Kippur with Rabbi Sid, and it came up. He asked me for it. If anyone else is interested, I'd be willing to share it if you are.
Yeah, actually, I'd shared it with Rabbi Rachel a number of years ago, and she had enjoyed it. There's a lot of things that our family thinks are largely made up, like tall tales that they hosted the czar during. It's just like all this crazy stuff. But and it was also translated by my grandparents' rabbi in New Haven, Connecticut, at some point out of the Hebrew. Anyway, I'm happy to share it. I'd love to know what you think about it. It is a kind of crazy, wonderful thing to have. And yeah, sure.
Hey, families are crazy. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's good crazy, good crazy. Thank you. I look forward to seeing it.
Next is Scott or Margie. Arnold.
Thanks. Susan's comment about, going to Shivas and learning more about your friends in the context. This is a good segue to my comment or thought. I grew up with my parents and my younger sister and my grandmother. We were a multi-generational family in Long Island. And I got to talk to my grandmother a lot, and she reminisced about things, and but you could always tell she was also holding back and not talking about things much that she was uncomfortable with. She lost most of her immediate family in the Holocaust, and she was never comfortable about that. And it amazed me as I got older how little I learned about the Holocaust from my grandmother. But that, I think that was symptomatic of the times. This is growing up in the late 60s and 70s. But a couple of years ago, years after my mother had passed away, and my grandmother, the grandmother who lived with us, I should say, was my mother's mother. And she had two kids, my mom and my uncle. My mom passed away now 13 years ago, and my uncle passed away many years ago when he died tragically young while I was still in college. And his son, my first cousin, called me a couple of years ago out of the blue and said, his daughter was doing some research on 23andMe and found out that apparently in the early 20s, my uncle was born in 1917, my mom was born in 1920. And there was apparently another sibling who was born in the early 20s and who apparently died in infancy that none of us ever knew about. So he was asking me if I ever heard about this. I never heard about it. My sister never heard about it. My cousin, David, my first cousin, we talked to his siblings. They never heard about it. And of course, there's no one left to tell us whether this is a mistake, 23andMe got it wrong, or these records are accurate. And there was this, tragic event that none of us ever knew about. That somehow 2 generations didn't let us know about. And it just, there's nothing I can do, but I want to thank Rabbi Sid for raising this topic in the sermon last night, because it sensitized me to the fact that, well, are there things I'm holding back? Because I can do something about that. I can be more open with my own kids about things that they might be interested in, and certainly encourage them to ask questions as well. My thoughts.
And I was going to share something completely different. I'm extremely fortunate that I still have my parents alive, 88 and 91 here in Bethesda. And what's kind of interesting is they didn't want an oral history, which our family wanted them to be a whole package a few years ago, but they did allow me to interview them individually. And so I do have a lot on tape. However, the longer they live, the more I'm starting to hear more stories. And so this is also reinforcing, thank you, Sid, how I need to sit down with them again, because I just took my mother to a doctor's appointment yesterday and she shared with something that I hadn't heard yet. And I feel very fortunate that I still have time to even ask more questions. So thank you for the reminder and reinforcement of it, and everybody else's stories too.
Yeah, thanks, Scott and Margie. Thank you.
Neil Maxine.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted. There were so many things that you said that were incredibly rich and valuable. But one thing which stood out for me was the thought that I've often had at funerals, that it was so sad that the person at the funeral didn't get to watch it, in a Huckleberry Finn kind of way, where you get to watch your own funeral. And I was struck by, I have a vague recollection that Suzanne Isaacson did this, but it seems like a Da'at Shalom could be groundbreaking in one of the many ways that it is, in encouraging people to have, I don't know what you call it, celebration of life ceremonies, but essentially a funeral before you die, so that you can see what people would be saying about you at your funeral while you're still living. And I wondered if there's some kind of way of establishing or supporting a tradition of people doing that. As I said, I think Susanna Isaacson did it and I couldn't attend. But it would be nice, to start a tradition of having celebration of life ceremonies where it's funerals with everything except the death. Before people can't watch it anymore. Anyway, I was just wondering if there's a way to Dutchland to be creative in that realm.
Yeah, well, I was at that event Susanna Isaacson
You were.
orchestrated. It was quite amazing. Susanna was actually, in her own inimitable way, very transparent, saying, I'm doing this because I want to enjoy my funeral and hear what people are going to say. It was a beautiful event. And I had that exact conversation with Susanna at the event after it was over, when we were doing refreshments and the like, because I thought also that it had all the trappings of a very rich life cycle passage, which does not exist in the Jewish tradition, so to speak, but why not create it? That's part of the genius of Reconstructionism, is that you don't just have to do what's the past, but actually create something new. So I think there's a seed of an idea there. Many people know that there is something close to that at Dutch Loam with honoring our elders.
Right.
We've been doing for several years. Several people on this screen have been honored in that way. At age 83, they're featured after the service in the sanctuary where they're being interviewed. It's not exactly what Susanna did because people aren't talking about the individual, but you learn a ton about people, and I found those very rewarding. So that's close to it. So it would require a little bit of kind of work to kind of transform the honoring the elders to having something which we need a better name for than mock funeral, right? I mean, I don't think.
Right.
I don't think that.
I think Susanna called it a life celebration, which is a nice term. But it does seem like we just need another committee.
Okay. Yeah, are you offering to chair that, Neil?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, anyone interested in that should let themselves be known, and we'll see if we can get that going. Okay, I think we're up to
Joel or Vicky.
Joel and Vicky. Yeah.
Hi, and once again, Sandy, congratulations for the new baby, grandkid, and to everyone who's had a new arrival in their family this year. No greater mitzvah. Relative to a celebration of life, got to be careful about that. Retirement is one event where people will get up and laud you or otherwise attack you. And I've had several retirements. And probably the funniest line at one of the retirements was raised by my son after he showed a picture of me and my full beard in Africa after several years. And he said, here's my dad in his Tora Bora face. But I do want to actually, number one, underscore Lisa Fuentes' comment where she said, use their names, their full names, working around the world. Nothing is more important than people than two things. One, their names, and two, thank you in whatever language you're talking about. So Lisa, I'm with you. The next thing I wanted to say is it's important to choose who it is interviews you. I made a big mistake at NIH. They courted us for StoryCorps. When someone would come, they'd set up the recording booth, et cetera. And I chose a very close friend of mine who's a writer, editor, former UIS a member. No offense, Arthur. But anyway, so we spent some time talking about my background, and he got a fair number of things out of place, wrong, compared to my son, who gave me a gift of StoryCorps. And that he interviewed me and Vicky over several hours and got it right. So there are both learning opportunities when you teach, and there are teaching opportunities. But here, the second mistake you can make is timing when you talk to your kids about transfer of legacy. And we have a lot of family vacations, which are very active, athletic. We've gone to World Cup. We've gone to Carnival. We've gone to a number of different places. And at one of them, at the end, at a big celebratory banquet, I brought up the issue of, well, you know, Vicki and I won't always be here. And it's important that you share with us the types of things in our family, actually possessions and otherwise. And this got the biggest silence that I've ever heard or not heard. And it really blackened the entire 2 weeks of the vacation. Because I said, Dad, don't talk to us about
you not being
that, about not being here. And in particular, don't talk to us about passing on family heirlooms or the rest of that we might want. Said, you tell us what you would like us to have. And that goes to both possessions and writings. So the last thing I'd like to say is to quote Winston Churchill, history will treat me kindly because I will write it. So put that in your quiver for those who want to pass on a legacy on your own terms.
Yeah. You know, this issue, there's a similarity between attorneys who work with people around wills, you know, confront this all the time. When you avoid things like financial planning for the future or funeral arrangements because you don't want to talk about death with your kids. And that is one of the things that keeps many people away from doing things like ethical wills or having the kind of conversations that I was promoting last night because there's a squeamishness about raising the fact that one day we won't be here. And once that gets into the air, it does color a lot of the way people react around it. So it's one of the challenges just to think about. Before we go to the next person, Marcia, there's a lot of rich things in the chat box, including Marcia, you asked about the ethical will book. And thank you, Diane, for coming up with the Jack Weimer book. That's the classic. It's called So That Your Values Live On, Ethical Wills and How to Prepare Them by Rabbi Jack Weimer and Nathaniel Spamfer. So a lot of other good resources in the chat box, so we'll keep them going. And Marcia, you're next. Good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too. And again, Mazel Tov. Susie Turnbull told me about your Simcha, so I was so excited to be able to hear that. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons that I remain as an Adat Shalom participant in being at services is because I always so look forward to your annual sermon on Yom Kippur, and it always inspires me. And it gives me so much to think about. And there were so many pearls of wisdom with that. It was wonderful. It was so topical because my brother and I had the conversation last night where he wanted his son, my nephew, his son, is going to be having a baby in the next few weeks. And he thought it was so important for my nephew to be able to know who his grandparents were and great-grandparents. And so they were both in Columbus, Ohio. My brother took them to the cemetery, showed the tombstones, and then gave that verbal history about who they were so that my nephew would know and would, never forget in that area. But I was very fortunate also is that I had the foresight a number of years ago when my mom was still alive and her sisters to record some of their history. And I have to tell you, it was one of the funniest experiences just asking about when, as teenagers, they came from Russia to be able to emigrate to the United States. And it was the funniest experience because they all had different memories of what happened when their mother, I should say, my grandmother and their mother came to the United States as a young teenager. And then they all kept interrupting each other saying, no, she did this, no, she did that. And so the great thing is I have all their zest and enthusiasm and knowledge on film. And then lastly, on my dad's side, we were very lucky to be honored by the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba, Canada. Or on my dad's side, they have a Tree of Life, and we were forced at that point in time because I really didn't know a lot about my dad's, history. but to be able to get all that genealogy, because very, humbly we were honored, and my dad and his family were honored in that area. But so we were very lucky to be able to learn so much more about it. And again, bringing my brother up to Winnipeg, Manitoba, to be able to hear from all of our first cousins about, what their parents were all about. So you've touched so much of what we're all about. And so thank you so much.
Thanks, Marcia. Thanks. Let me just say, I'm looking at, well, it looks like we have 6 people in the queue. And just being mindful of time and the fact that I actually want to go back to the synagogue, let me ask that nobody else gets in the queue now, but we'll take the 6 people who are actually in the queue, which is through Alicia, and let's continue the sharing. It's beautiful.
So next is, I guess that's Bruce or Malka, one of the two.
All right. Just a few things. My son is a documentary filmmaker. And for him, it's very important for people to realize that when you see a documentary, it's been edited by the filmmaker. And it's the filmmaker's opinion. So for example, my son made a film about his grandfather, Malka's father, and it's called Cooking with Zadie. It's a 45-minute film, and it's process of Malka's father is teaching Aaron how to make vegetarian soup and an apple cake. And in the process, he talks about his life. Among other things, he survived the Holocaust on Germany by being sent to Siberia. And it's very interesting, but it's in that context. But again, it's an edited thing. My son and my daughter decided several years ago to do something interesting. They interviewed me about my parents, and they interviewed my 3 siblings also about our parents, okay, with a same set of questions. I have 2 siblings who live in Israel, and myself, my brother live in the United States. And then he gave us the digital copy of the unedited responses that we all made. And I found it was very interesting. I haven't seen that for a while, but although it's the same parents, we all have a different take on what their feelings were, how they reacted, because my parents dealt with each one of us differently, as all parents do. Recently, my brother who lives in Philadelphia decided to write memoirs that he wanted to give to his grandchildren, or to his children and grandchildren. He wrote these, each one is about 50 pages, 2 of them. His children read it, and they said it's interesting, but their lives are quite busy. I and my siblings also read it, and we have a Zoom meeting once a week on Sundays. We've done this for over a year now, and we started discussing it. And what was interesting is that although the facts in many cases are the same, we all have a different interpretation of who our parents were, what they meant, what they were like, because they interacted with us differently. And so I think if you have siblings who happen to still be alive, okay, it'd be interesting to discuss with them, how do all of you individually view your parents? Not just the facts, but their discussions of what they desired, who they wanted to be, what were some of their regrets. I just found it very interesting that also because we are of different ages. I have a sister whose interactions with my parents were quite different than mine as a son. So all of these things created a complex mosaic of what what the previous generations were like.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you so much.
Next up is Abe Schuchman.
Yes, hello, excuse me, hello, everybody. And thank you, Rabbi Sid, for your beautiful sermon. Also, like many others, sounded very thought-provoking, and also Mazel Tov, being a grandfather. I wanted to share just a few thoughts on kind of the related question of what stories ought we share, what type of stories ought we share. And wanted to make 2 points. One is that as a child, my grandfather, it was extremely important to him to share stories from some very horrific and difficult times he went through, pogroms and so forth. And I distinctly remember him telling me these stories in his living room, and it became increasingly difficult to hear him because in the kitchen, my grandmother seemed to be dropping plates, constantly dropping plates. And there was obviously a profound difference of opinion on whether or not to share these stories. And my grandmother was very vocal that, Sam, my grandfather, Sam, Abe does not need to hear this. And my grandfather, Sam, was felt very strongly that it was extremely important that these stories be shared. And that I think for him, it was less about sharing the difficulties and more about it being stories of resilience, stories about the love and solidarity of he and his sisters going through this, stories he wanted to convey his love of America and the opportunity to be free, relatively free of anti-Semitism and so forth. And just generally stories of resilience. And those stories really have become a very integral part of who I am. And I'm so grateful that he was able to speak above the din of the plates and share those stories with me. And now as a parent, I have teenage twin boys. A lot of what my wife Ellie and I talk about is, well, what are the important stories? Because teenagers only have a limited attention span and not so inclined to listen to our stories. And I felt that one bit of advice that I got from people more wise than me was to not only share stories about my life around success, but also to share stories of my life around failure and mistakes. And I found that oftentimes my boys pay more attention to the stories that I share about my mistakes and what I learned from those mistakes than any successes I might have.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of wisdom, Abe. Thanks for passing it on. And I'll just go back to my sermon last night, the line from Ethan's book saying, "Nothing grows in the shade of a big tree." Part of the reason Ethan had to leave home to find himself is that his father cast a very large shadow. He was one of the most prominent civic leaders in Detroit and on the national Jewish scene. And there was no way that he could see how he could in any way compete with his father's reputation. And so he had to find his own way. So being able to share failures is a way to be a bit less intimidating. We don't think of ourselves as parents as intimidating to our children, but on some levels, our success does intimidate our kids. And if you read the studies, they do say that the current generation is unlikely to reach the earning power of our generation, which was never true in the past in America. So those kind of things, to the extent that salary or how much you're going to earn your wealth is one of the markers of success in America. Whether it should be or not is a whole nother question. Sharing some failures may be a way to open up some channels of communication.
Lisa, you're next in line.
First, I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories and information. I'm always very interested in this topic. So, Rabbi Sid, thank you, and congratulations to you and Sandy on becoming grandparents. This is my dog, Chester. He just came up here. I wanted to share two things. My family, both my mother and father lived difficult childhoods, had difficult, very poor childhoods. The parents were very poor, and they didn't really want to share about their lives a lot. But it was really important to me that I wanted to learn about their history and what life was like, and just learn more about my parents and my grandparents. So one day my mother invited over, when I was younger, invited my fourth and fifth cousins from New York, and they're like 80, 90 years old. And she invited them over to her house. And it was at that time that I sat down and I said, let's make a family tree. I want to learn more about what life was like in Mielec, Poland. And my mother says, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Let them be. And I said, no, it's really important for me to learn about my history and my family. And I'm so thankful that I did, because that's the only information that I have about my family from that wonderful afternoon. And I've been in communication with them for several years after that. So that was really special. And sometimes I believe children have to take the initiative to find out about their family and life, even if their parents don't want to say too much, because it's going to be lost forever. So there's different ways to do that. So that was my way of finding out some information. I also want to say I'm a teacher, and one of the things that I taught was culinary arts. And one of the projects I had, which is, I think, is one of the most memorable projects that a student can do, is have a family history cookbook. And that was a requirement for all my students for the 12 years I taught culinary. And they had to get 5 family recipes from their mothers, their fathers, extended family, aunts, uncles, anyone in the family. And then they had to have it written up. They had to also have a whole page written about their family and their history and where these recipes come from. So not just a recipe, but give me some history about your family. I said, this project is not just a grade. This project is for you to connect as a teenager with your family. So I have incredible, I copied their recipe books. They have recipes from all over the world. It's a very international class. It was great. And they let me copy it. They said it was okay. But this one girl, I'll never forget, she never talked to the elders in her family, and she addressed them as elders until I asked her to do this project. And in addition to sharing the recipes, she actually included the spices from the country where she was from. And so I could not only have the recipes, but get the smells and aromas and the feeling of her culture as well.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Lovely. Next is Larry or Marie.
Sorry there, and here we are. One bit of experience in recording family history and one warning. A bit of experience is about 10 years ago, I somehow volunteered at a family reunion in Philadelphia to start a family tree. And I did that. I got up to 350 or 400 people before Maureen said to me, are you a genealogist or are you going to work for a living? Because I got so into doing it. And this conversation reminds me I'd like to get back into doing that now. In doing it, I'll mention 2 things. One is someone had remarked on how a family tree genealogy can be very dry. I had one cousin born 16 years before I was, who had a fantastic memory and a fantastic facility for gossip. So our family tree has included in it at this point some stories of human interest stories, some bordering on the scandalous or perhaps salacious, and I think that's going to make it more interesting as we go along. I found out that we have relatives not only in on my father's side of the family, not only in the US and Israel, but South Africa, rural Scotland, all over the world. I got in touch with one guy who actually lives in this area. And after getting over his initial reaction, who the heck are you, by telling him the names of some of his family members, he said, I know nothing about my family whatsoever. Nobody was around to tell me, what am I? Who am I? Interesting conversation. So the warning, however, is I recorded interviews with my parents on VHS videotape many years ago when they were around. I recorded interviews with Maureen's parents at one point in the early 1980s. I recently went to, Maureen's mother recently had her 101st birthday, and I wanted to bring along a copy of the interview with her and with Maureen's late stepfather. I went to get them transcribed. I hadn't known that videotapes after a few years deteriorate 10% every year. So if you have videotapes, get them digitized while you can. Once things are digital, there's always going to be some way to play them. But if you're stuck with videotape, you're worse off than if you have 8mm film. The interviews of my parents, I haven't pulled out to get digitized yet because I'm so afraid they'll be gone as well. That's it.
Thanks, Larry. Carol and Bob, I think you might be the last ones. It looks like Alicia has left the room.
Okay, we'll keep it brief. You know, I grew up with a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins, but no grandparents. In fact, none of my relatives had grandparents. And I guess I thought that was normal. And I'm sorry that I never got to know any grandparents. On my father's side, they were killed in the war. On my mother's side, they died young. But something I haven't heard, and I wanted to bring it up as an idea for people. Several years ago, my daughter, I always ask, what do you want for your birthday? And she said, I want you to write a story about you and your family. And I'm going to pay for it. So she bought me a subscription to something called Story Worth. It wasn't that expensive. And basically what they do is every week they send you a question. What was it like growing up in your town? Where did you go to high school? Tell me about your... Anyways, I'm a little behind on it, a couple years behind on it, but it is absolutely one of my goals. And it's a way to, you know, to enable me to write what I think about it, or because you can substitute a question. If you don't like the question, put your own question in. And you create a book at the end of the day. Assuming you've paid the bill, you have a book, and you can put photographs in it and other kinds of pictures. And it's something that I want to do for my 3 kids. And it's just getting off my behind and doing it. So keep in mind, Storyworth. You can go online. It's maybe $40 a year for a year's worth of questions, and they create a book for you.
All right, thanks, Bob. Actually, I now know that you came on to this room about 10 minutes late because a rabbi once said that there are no coincidences. So the very first sharing we had in this room was by Bob Spurtis, who told a Storyworth story that his sons were never interested in their lives until one son subscribed to Storyworth. That was put in the chat box. So now we have a second endorsement of Storyworth. Maybe we can get some stock and help it to fund a new wing at a Dal Shalom or something, you know. But it sounds like it's good, worthwhile. I'm going to look into that for sure. Anyway, I always love the sharing. Clearly, as I expected, the sharing related, the things that my sermon triggered makes the sermon exponentially richer, not for any reason of my own, but because people have shared so fully of themselves and their stories, which has enriched stuff. And I do hope people act on it. Just to share a final story, again, in the parking lot last night where I spent a little bit of time, there was a woman who remembered a sermon from 3 years ago when I also quoted Marshall Duke. I actually spent more time on Marshall Duke 3 years ago. And she told me that because of that sermon, she who grew up in Los Angeles and whose parents still live there, she realized she knew next to nothing about her family's life story in LA. And she went on a journey to kind of discover that. She brought her children to LA and orchestrated a whole tour of where her parents grew up in two different, very different neighborhoods of LA with different stories. And she credited it all to having heard a sermon and deciding to do something about it. So if some of what I raised last night can inspire, incentivize you to do some things with the generation before you and the generation that you gave birth to and are raising, or even generations after that, as I say in Hebrew, harezet mishubach, it would be for a blessing. So wishing you a Gemar Chatima Tova, a healthy and happy new year. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back at shul soon.